I'm sure you've seen the news about Jorge Martin. And I did apologise for our last podcast that we didn't cover it, but as we were recording the last one, this story broke from motorsport.com, and let's be honest, it's been the talk of MotoGP since, and we're here to discuss why this has happened, where it came from, what's the options for Jorge Martin in the future with Aprilia, and yeah, who's going to replace him if he does leave? Where will he go? There's plenty of things to discuss here. And joining me, of course, Jordan Morland, is Pete McLaren and Lewis Duncan. Lewis, what do you think of this? You did a feature piece on it, which I would highly recommend to our listeners to go and read about why this is the wrong choice, essentially, and why it came so early in this relationship with Martin and Aprilia. It almost seems like it's been doomed from the start, really, hasn't it? With the way this has all just played out and how 2025 has went so far.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's really a voice in the paddock right now that's particularly understands really any of the thought process here, because if unless you haven't been paying attention, Jorge Martin has completed one sprint race this season. He's not been on the bike for various injuries. He's injured again after a crash in the Qatar Grand Prix. He's ridden the bike fully fit this year for 13 laps. And so when we're hearing things now that he's trying to invoke a performance clause that stated that he would, if he was not within the top 5 championship contenders by the French Grand Prix, then he could exercise this option in the contract to leave. It's obviously taken everyone by surprise, because we haven't seen Jorge Martin ride the bike, really, And we talk about, it's been a bit doomed from the start, but I think that kind of forgets how well the relationship started. This was a rider that was didn't get what he wanted from Ducati, decided that he was going to walk away from a winning bike, and we'll come back to that later, to go and fulfill his dream of being a factory rider, which he thought he deserved at that point. And to his credit, he was the championship leader. He did go on to win the championship. You can understand why you would think that. Yeah. It went to sign for Aprilia. The deal was done. He was at no point during last year when Aprilia there were struggles was he concerned. He knew that this was a different project. It was going to take time. We get to the test in November in Barcelona, and it starts off really well. Fabiano Sterlachini comes to the media afterwards and says, look, Jorge Martin is a mix between a world champion and a leader. It's really sounded like he'd already very quickly galvanised this team and really rallied them around him. There were several interviews over the winter where he was saying, look, it doesn't matter about winning the championship this year. I've won one. This is now a new project. It's not really realistic to think about winning the championship this year. Maybe in 2026, but we need to just take it step by step, work on the project, develop it. So we had all this positive kind of attitude to it, and I think it really changed kind of perception to Jorge Martin a little bit, from kind of maybe being just this sort of pure racer, let's say, to being someone that could actually genuinely be a very good factory team leader and someone that could really develop a project. And yeah, then we've had the pre-season injuries and the numerous injuries. But there was never any indication that this was a relationship that was, going to be compromised anyway. And I think this is where there's been this sudden change is really confusing, because there was no indications beforehand. It wasn't as if he got off the bike in first tests or anything like that and was like, oh, his bike's bad. There was nothing like that from his body language either. It's really come out of the blue, and yeah, all the ramifications from this are, there are a lot of ramifications for this, and none of them really are all that positive for Aprilia, for Martin, for the championship. So yeah, now we enter a very interesting phase of the rider market that we weren't certainly expecting.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? It's the bombshell of the rider market that no one really foreseen. And yeah, nothing officially has came out from Aprilia or Jorge Martin yet on social media, across anything, like even a press release. But Pete did ask them for a comment, and they says, listen, no comment on the matter. They didn't deny it, did they? And there's been radio silence since. You think if it was false, they would say it's false. And I think in this instance, it's really all about, is there more to this? Is there more under the surface where it's I don't know, is it a team thing? Obviously, he says it's the bike. It's obviously that's why the clause is in there. But it's just very odd. Even going back to the comments from the team launch, he says they're ready to kill for this team. They're working in a way to, take the fight to Ducati essentially. And we're 3 months after that. This is what's happened. It's so strange, isn't it?
It is, and there must be more to this than we know at the moment, isn't it? There's going to be sort of push and pull, isn't there? And always in rider-team negotiations or situations, and we're all a bit confused as to what exactly the push and pull is that's led to this almost a legal dispute, isn't it? And I think that comes back to, as you say, the silence that we're hearing is because potentially this is heading to a courtroom somewhere, isn't it? And that's why you're not allowed to say anything, because it could compromise your case. So. As you say, no official denial, no comments at all from anybody, which just tells you there is something going on here, because it would have been stamped out, much earlier on if it wasn't true. So, what exactly has led to this? As you guys have said, we don't really know what Jorge Martin can do on an Aprilia because he's barely ridden it. So it's hard to see it from the performance side. He's had a terrible run of injuries and everything else, but one of those was nothing to do with MotoGP. The one in the Qatar race, let's face it, was just a racing incident. The accident itself was a nothing accident. He was just incredibly unlucky to have a rider close behind him. And then the Sepang accident, you can almost pick between the rider, the bike, and the tyres, and you could argue each one of those, couldn't you? So, I don't think any of us saw this happening. This clause, as Lewis has said, you guys have said, it's pretty common to have clauses in contracts. So we assume that this is the case. The issue, this is just my personal opinion at this stage, is that it's how you deal with that. This clause has been there. It's up for, the cutoff point is the French Grand Prix. We know that Jorge went to the French Grand Prix, didn't he? Bit of a low key visit, presumably to I don't know, to settle this issue of the clause. I don't know. We don't know what it was. Does he have to say to them, I don't want to, I'm committing, I'm continuing or not, or what do we do given that you haven't ridden the bike? We don't know what the terms of the contract are, but this whole situation seems to be linked to this clause, doesn't it? We know it's around this timeline, this point in the championship. But how can you, as you guys have been saying, how can you have a clause that's based on performance when your star rider hasn't been on the bike? So it's I think it's interesting what we're hearing also about moving the clause, forwards. I think that also, if you're Aprilia and you're expecting to at least, you presumably agreed to this clause originally. A disaster situation has arisen. I think you're thinking this clause now ends and that's it and everything continues. Now, if suddenly into the negotiations comes this possibility of moving it on again to later in the year, I can imagine, putting myself in Aprilia's position, you wouldn't be very pleased about that, would you? And so then, on the other hand, I guess on the other side, they're saying, well, look, this clause exists and you've agreed to it. So it just seems to me like it's a legal situation, but it's disastrous, really. Well, lose, I would say, almost for the rider and the team potentially. Where do they go from here? I don't see any sort of happy ending to this at the moment.
Absolutely, and that's my question to you, Lewis. It's like, if he does come back, is the damage not already done? It's like when you start already saying what you're essentially going to do, you want to leave, and you're going to come back, and they are saying there's going to be a 6-race sort of, how could you say, like ultimatum Martin's going to give Aprilia to try and convince him to stay. But if you're Aprilia and you're thinking, well, clearly he might not be mentally in this team, surely he's not going to give 100% when he comes back.
Yeah, if I've just before that, just to kind of clarify, when we talk about the 6-race thing, we believe it'll be 6 races because we understand, the kind of timeline that's been given for Martin's recovery is the German Grand Prix. So it's understood that he's willing to extend this deadline to the Misano Grand Prix for where this performance clause kicks in. Now, we don't know what this performance clause says, and we've only heard that it was kind of in effect that if he was not amongst the championship contenders. So if that is the wording of it or something to that effect, moving it back to Misano isn't really going to shape anything. Martin's 177 points off the championship lead right now. By the time he comes back, he'll be well over 200. He's not going to be a championship contender. So the moving of this clause, if that is the stipulation, if that is what the performance has to be, doesn't really seem logical. So again, there are elements here that we don't know yet, and because Aprilia hasn't said anything, Martin hasn't said anything, and probably won't for a while.
Yeah.
We do have to. There's a great deal of speculation here, so yeah, that's the kind of the confusing element to me. That if it was a stipulation that he has to be a championship contender, then that's not going to change by Mazzano. So is a stipulation that he has to? Is it a stipulation that Aprilia has to be? This is what we need to know. Essentially, this is what we need to find out from ideally Aprilia or Albert Valera, Jorge Martin's manager. Going back to to your question there, Jordan, the trust is gone, the trust is eroded, and for me, the big kind of sticking point now is that, okay, Jorge Martin is given this ultimatum, this kind of extension to see if the Aprilia can be, let's assume that it's now the Aprilia can be more competitive, but again, the wording of this contract is, this clause will be quite critical for Aprilia's legal case, because if he's looking for an extension but the wording of the contract says one thing, the extension is a sort of a false flag, really. It's not going to change anything, so Aprilia might not even accept that because it doesn't, from a legal perspective, make sense. But assume that, they accept the extension. How can you possibly trust a rider who's already intimated that he wants to leave, having not ridden the bike, to push himself to actually try and match that performance clause? That's for me the big issue here, is how can you possibly trust him? How can you possibly look at any lap time that he does, any race result, and go, yeah, he pushed, oh, well, the data says this. Well, the data's just lines on a laptop that doesn't prove that he's pushing anything. Riders are very clever at being able to ride within themselves. Oh, he was only 2/10 off Marco Bezzecchi. Okay, well, this is a reigning world champion. He should be 3/10 quicker than Marco Bezzecchi. That's going to be the kind of things that will be going back and forward, and that's when doubt comes in, and when every single lap time, every single result, every single session, if you're Massimo Rivola, if you're, management, if you're, the owners of Aprilia, the Piaggio Group, you look at all that, you go, how can we believe what we see here?
Yeah.
And that's not to criticize Jorge. It's not comment on Jorge Martin's commitment as a MotoGP rider. We know he is a fast MotoGP rider, but anyone in a situation like this is when anyone who's handed in their notice at work, that moment that email is sent, something switches in your brain. You're not given 100% anymore. Because why? What's the point? You're leaving at the end of the month. Yeah. There's almost an element of, well, I'm leaving. It doesn't really matter what I'm going to do. What are you going to do? Fire me? And that will be a problem here for racers. I think there'll be a lot of purists out there that will think, oh, well, racers, they always give 100%. No. When you're in a situation where you don't want to ride a bike, especially a bike that you've crashed on a few times, you're not then going to come back and try and push to meet a performance clause to then lock yourself into a contract that you don't want to be a part of in the first place. Because you look at next year as well, the 2027 rider market will start really, really early. We're going to be talking like January, February when we might start getting our first contract signed. And already, if Martin's looking for an exit and he does stay with Aprilia, he's already going to be looking anyway at the way out for 2027. So Aprilia finds itself in a no-win situation. And, if a really messy legal battle comes into it, that's going to make things worse. And you have to look at it that if Aprilia wins a legal battle, fine. Martin doesn't want to be here. They'd then be forcing a rider to stay here who doesn't want to be here, and then you have to convince an entire team around him, a whole group of mechanics that are spending 22 weeks a year, plus tests, plus everything, away from the family, away from their kids, really, really under really, really stressful, strenuous working conditions, to rally around this rider, to fix a bike when he crashes it, to make sure it's a winning bike, or a bike that can be competitive as possible for a rider that has already said that he's not appreciative of he's not appreciative of the effort that's been done so far for him. Because that's what this move from Martin is saying to Aprilia, that he doesn't believe in the team, and therefore he's not grateful for the effort they put in already. And that's the way that Aprilia will take it.
Yeah.
So there's just an unwinnable situation. It becomes a problem for Jorge Martin as well if Aprilia does win this legal battle, because then what do? They've got the power now. If they win the legal battle, hold him to his contract, any of the potential places he wants to go, and we think it's Honda is the main one, they'll have to sign someone else. Then Aprilia is in the position where it can go, okay, well, you didn't want to be here. We don't want you to be here, so we're terminating your contract. And then Martin ends up without a ride for next year.
Yeah.
Which is a big possibility. A different situation, but remember what happened to Andrea Dovizioso? He priced himself out the rider market and was then on the sidelines for almost a whole year.
Yeah.
Just because he's a world champion doesn't mean that he's infallible. You know, he's invincible to being left out in the cold here, and that is now the risk that he runs. And you'd like to think that he's got good management there, and that contract is pretty airtight to stop that happening. But Massimo Rivola's come from Formula One, and that's where contracts and legal disputes in Formula One are a lot tougher, and you know, he knows the game here, so this is not going to be the easy fight that I think Martin and his management expect it to be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you covered that very well, Lewis, and I don't even want to get into F1 contracts. I can talk about that for ages. They're incredibly fun to read about when you hear some of them.
Sorry, just to interrupt there. I mean, this is an interesting kind of comparison because Formula One has a contract recognition board. Whenever a driver contract is signed, that there's a legal process there. MotoGP doesn't have that, and you have to also think that the part of the mess that Aprilia found itself in is because there isn't that kind of neutral board that can
you need someone there to look at it.
So
that could be something for the future potentially.
Rider Safety Commission meeting at Friday on Silverstone, you can be damn sure that'll probably be something that'll get brought up by a few riders, because you know this sets a precedent if it goes the way that Jorge Martin wants it to go.
Yeah.
Just
Pete?
Yeah, I was going to say, just on the, well, two things really. First thing on the clauses, is it significant that Aprilia and KTM haven't had a podium so far this year? Because sometimes it's not just what the individual rider's done, but on the point of view of how competitive is the bike, which is really what these clauses are about. Quite often it's a podium finish or a rider in the top six, even if it's not you, as in the person who signed that contract, but if someone else on the same bike as you is in the top six or has been on the podium, that could also be in the mix there. So it might be significant that they haven't had a podium so far this year. That's something that could potentially change if you push that down the line a bit. Related to that, you know, Maverick losing that podium in Qatar, could that have also swung things? You know, we know there's lots of talk about Costa, people like that. You know, potentially that would have been a KTM podium, and any clauses, if they exist in other KTM riders' contracts, would have then been null and void because a KTM would have been on the podium. But that's one thing. Other thing is I'm putting together a story about riders that have left contracts early. I'm up to 12, just only recently. So variety of reasons, but I'll go through them and you can chat about any others. But so Marco Melandri, Colin Edwards, Cal Crutchlow, Sam Lowes, Jonas Folger, Johan Zarco, Carol Abraham, Jorge Lorenzo, Andrea Iannone, obviously the WADA thing, Maverick Vinales, Andrea Dovizioso, Paul Espargaro, Marc Marquez. So it happens fairly, you know, once every couple of years that someone leaves unexpectedly early, let's say, but not, you know, quite often anyway. It's by mutual consent. It's a rider retiring is a common theme there. Other times it's you know, because they don't see the purpose of continuing if it's not going to be successful. But this is certainly, I think, the biggest surprise of all of those, I suppose, except maybe Mark. But then that was quite a lot. By the time it was announced, it was the writing was on the wall, wasn't it? But and certainly, you know, opposite situation in terms of how long he'd given the team, the manufacturer, and the bike. I mean, as we keep going back to, we don't really know what Jorge Martin could do on this bike yet because we haven't seen it. So I think that's why to be bringing up performance clauses when you've barely had a chance to get to know the bike just is such a shock, isn't it?
That's the question for me. I'm like, how can you base your assumptions of? I think he's done roughly 150 odd laps if you count testing the weekend in Qatar, and you're thinking, surely you can't be thinking that this bike is just terrible from those laps. I know that people say, yeah, the Aprilia has regressed. To be honest, it's not went the same way as the other manufacturers, but you look this year, Ayagura has done really good things on that from the first two rounds. I mean, Marco Bezzecchi, yes, hasn't been outstanding, but like he hasn't been at the back of the grid, so he hasn't. Ralph Fernandez, I mean, I don't think Ralph Fernandez personally should be with MotoGP, that's my opinion, but he hasn't been horrific. He was P7 at Le Mans. The bike isn't terrible. Yes, it is difficult to ride, but it's not like we're looking at the 2023 Honda here, Lewis, like where it was just essentially it wasn't rideable at all, and it forced Marc Marquez to go. Joan Mir had so many crashes, even Nakagami. It's not that situation, is it, with Aprilia?
Well, the crucial element to this is that Jorge Martin was signed by Aprilia to be the difference maker. And that's the long and the short of it. He was signed to be the guy to help bring that bike to the front of the grid and to be the one who can take it that extra 10%. In the same way that we see with Fabio Quartararo at Yamaha. You know, I have done it with Quartararo at Yamaha, but especially lately, you know, with Mark at Honda over all these years, and right now at Ducati, I guess, if you look at, you know, the performances there, you know, with Acosta at KTM, that was Jorge Martin's role. That was what Aprilia saw for him, and that was the challenge that he accepted. So I think this is the thing that is probably will have upset Aprilia the most, and I think is the thing that I'm struggling to really come to kind of to terms with in terms of trying to understand this decision process, because he's complaining about a bike that he was signed to be the one to develop, and he hasn't had that opportunity yet because he's been injured. That's nothing to do with the bike. Let's face it, him crashing is nothing to do with the actual bike. The crashes in Sepang were, you know, Aprilia really went to bat for him as well about that. They continued to publicly blame Michelin, even though Michelin was like, yeah, look, we've got the data, we've got everything. Yes, what Massimo says here is correct, that the tyre was a bit, but like, here's the actual reason, you know, etc., etc. And they Aprilia wouldn't have any of it, at least publicly. They still defended their rider because I think there is a belief that it was probably just a cold tyre thing. It was just, and that's a rider fault, really. Let's be honest about that. You know, the crash in Qatar was just unfortunate. That was nothing to do with the bike. The bike didn't do that.
The testing, well, the recovery crash that he had in Supermoto.
Well, that was his own fault.
That's his own fault.
So,
and Aprilia can go there. Well, that's clearly not us, is it?
Well, exactly. So this is, you know, and you can see that with the other riders. They're not having all these big incidents. It's not like last year with Miguel Oliveira in Indonesia with the bike broke, and we've seen a few times over the years with Aprilia where the bike has done something it shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
None of these incidents that Martin has had. So if that's going to end up being something that people will try and blame for, then like you need a big dose of reality there. But he was signed to be the one to develop this bike, and he can't do that right now because he's injured. But he always said from the outset, this year is about building it step by step. You know, if I can get, you know, podiums at the end of the year, maybe some race wins, great. But fundamentally, I'm here to build the project. So either he was lying to everyone, or he just doesn't have the belief in himself to make that happen. And he hasn't, but okay, he was factory supported rider at Ducati. He's not ever been a factory rider. So, you know, maybe he isn't good enough to be a factory rider in the same way that Fabio Quartararo is, or Marc Marquez is, or Pecco Bagnaia is, or someone like that. Maybe that's the admission here. But how is that going to be any different if he goes to Honda, for example, which is a manufacturer that is very much in the rebuilding phase? Everyone's going to look at the result sheets and go, oh, well, they've got a race win this year. Yeah, okay, that was in wet conditions. On a bike that, since we got to Europe, hasn't quite looked as strong as it was in those flyaway portions, certainly next to the Yamaha. So, you know, and then also he's got to develop an 850cc bike as well. So if this is a rider that just kind of wants a fast machine, you know, isn't super confident in being a factory rider, then you're at the wrong era for that, because we're about to have a massive regulation shake-up. So, yeah, there's just all these elements here that just don't line up.
Yeah, it's odd because this is what we're going to discuss next. I think it's interesting, Pete, the next move, if he leaves and he gets out of that Aprilia contract, would other manufacturers look at him and go, well, if he's doing it to them, would he do it to us? And this creates a reputational problem then, doesn't it, with the manufacturers? Honda, for example, I mean, they're on a crest now. You look at it, Zarco winning for them. You've seen progression with that bike. And would they want to bag on Martin, if that makes sense, knowing that, okay, he hasn't committed to the Aprilia? Would he do the same to us? Or do you think that it's different because it's Honda? I know it's not disrespectful to Aprilia, but Martin, has he maybe looked at Honda being the goal here, in the sense of okay, they know what they're doing. I've seen the progression, and of course, not to mention Alicia Sabarro, his good friend, is there as well as test rider. Do you think that that would be something for the manufacturers to consider if they wanted to sign him, if they can sign him, obviously?
Yeah, well, I think if we look at past examples, look at how long it took Zarco to build back up after he left the factory KTM team.
Yeah.
You know, he had to go right to the lowest of the satellite Ducatis, wasn't it, the following year, and then build his way all the way back. And it looks like, well, he's trying to get into a factory seat again for next year, but how many years did that take, you know? And you look at
6, isn't it, really, when you think about it? It's mad.
Yeah. You look at, ironically, you look at Maverick, you know, when he left, the team that took the gamble on him in that situation was Aprilia. So, and they're the ones that are now obviously, you know, potentially on the other side of the coin. So, I think it's going to, you know, Honda. Let's be honest, probably like all the manufacturers, they're not going to do anything until everything is settled legally and a rider is free. They're not going to get involved and you know. And just coming back to that, as you guys have said, that the deals for the 27 era will be done from the start of next year. So really, where's I don't see the rush anyway. You know, even if at the back of his mind, Jorge Martin thinks, you know what, I'm not sure I can turn this around. Well, in 2 years, there's a whole new set of regulations. But in probably, less than a year, people will be signing deals for those new regulations. So why the rush now when you could still... Let's take the Honda example. If you really, I need to be at Honda, well, sign for Honda in January of next year for the 27 era. I don't see the Honda suddenly becoming this dominating bike next year. I mean, Zarco's won on it in a wet race.
Yeah.
You know, let's be honest.
And let's face it, that wasn't really a wet race. He was geared up to win there, but Jack Miller was 10 seconds ahead of him.
Yeah.
You know, at that point when everyone was on wet tires, so there was a lot of luck involved in that as well.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see the Honda. I mean, the Honda's improving, no doubt about it, and it's gonna, and you know, who knows what's going to happen in the 27 era with the Pirelli tires and everything else. It's going to be a big unknown for everybody, isn't it? So I don't know. I just don't see. I don't see, coming back to the push and pull thing, I don't see the big pull to join any other manufacturer at this exact moment. I don't see why you wouldn't at least wait and see what the 850 bikes are like when they start testing. There'll be lap times. People will know, you know, even if it's a private test and the lap times aren't published, the other teams will be keeping a close eye on what exactly, you know, the other manufacturers are up to. Where do we stand? Are we a long way off in terms of pace? They will know, you know, roughly how the 850 bikes are performing from, we know, the testing starts in January, isn't it? There's a ban until then. So, you know, why not wait? And I just don't see the big pull to suddenly rip everything up right now.
Well, the interesting kind of element to this as well, the Honda thing, is that there are there's been one other rider that has been quite prominently factored into Honda conversations for the factory team next year, and that's Pedro Costa, whose manager is Albert Valera, who manages Jorge Martin. So this is the other strand of this. Is this almost a confirmation that Acosta's staying put, or is Acosta kind of being shafted here? Because if I was Honda and you're looking at the two options, 27-year-old, okay, world champion, but probably in the midst of his career peak, versus 20-year-old rookie sensation last year. We know what, you know, the ceiling's not even, you know, there's not a ladder tall enough to get to that ceiling yet for Pedro Costa. You know, you're looking at the situations there. Pedro's at KTM. Things aren't really looking too good there right now. The future's very uncertain. Here's a guy that, you know, you put him on a Honda, you look at the way the Honda kind of behaves, that could be a very good fit for him. You know, Honda, how do you take Jorge Martin for a year and then hope that someone else doesn't take Pedro Costa, or do you take him now? Because, you know, let's play devil's advocate here. For example, if Pecco Bagnaia's performances don't start picking up next year, does Ducati look at forming some sort of all-conquering evil empire team with Marc Marquez and Pedro Costa at its factory squad? And then if you're Honda and you've lost Pedro Costa to a Ducati, you're going to sit there thinking, why the hell did we do that? Okay, yeah, Martin's a good rider, but that's Pedro Costa on a Ducati with Marc Marquez. We're not winning anything now for the next however long this carries on for. So this is the strange thing here. So does this almost then lead to maybe a falling out between Acosta and his management? Because I'm sure he would probably quite like to get on that Honda right now, given everything that's happened at KTM. So there's just all these things are just very, very you know, there's just a lot of there's going to be a big fallout from whatever way this goes. The other element to this is Alicia Sabarro's name's been brought up a lot. Alicia Sabarro, everyone needs to remember, was the one who really helped facilitate that move from Martin to Aprilia. And I don't want to kick up anything right now, but it's been quite interesting that Alicia's generally, if you look at his social media, there's not been too much sort of content between him and Martin lately. The two of them, we know, are very good friends and spend a lot of time together, and things have gone a bit quiet there. So I'd like to know what his thoughts are on this, if he is in fact in Martin's ear saying, look, this Honda's quite good, or if in fact he's quite upset that this is what's happened, given he put quite a lot of his reputation on the line to Aprilia to be like, look, here's the guy you should get. Pay him whatever he needs to be paid, and that's what they did. They didn't sign Fabio Quartararo last year because they couldn't match they didn't want to go above the sort of, I think it was about €4 million a year for the contract for Fabio. We understand it's probably double that for Martin. Let's be honest, that's the kind of contract he would have been looking for. And they were hoping that Martin would kind of be their Quartararo figure, and now, so the management will be quite burned by that as well. So, yeah, I'd be interested to know I'd be interested to get Alicia Sabarro's side of the story and what his thoughts are, because, unfortunately, or maybe unwillingly, he is kind of a central figure around the whole sort of ecosystem of this thing right now.
Where else could he go? And it's like, the only other option I could think of, say everything went the absolute shit here, right? And like he had no seat for the second half of this year, so it got really bad legally. Does he wait till next year and he goes, I'll do 1 year Pramac Yamaha or something, just as a filler year, just to get him out of a situation, to keep him bike fit almost? Because let's be honest, he hasn't rode a bike that much anyway since November last year, and it's like, does he go back to a team where he knows, and it's like kind of like his little comfort blanket where he can understand, yeah, I feel okay in this environment? Is that what it maybe comes down to also, Pete, the environment that he's in at Aprilia? Has it overwhelmed him, the fact that he's away from, quote unquote, his team, essentially? Because you know what the relationship was like with Pramac? It was so tight, wasn't it?
Yeah, although he's got his crew chief with him, of course, doesn't he?
Yeah, true, yeah.
He came across with him, and again, it just comes back to they haven't really had a chance, have they?
That's what I'm thinking. There's so many options, isn't there?
But coming to the Pramac angle, I mean, yes, he knows the team very well, but he has zero knowledge of the Yamaha. So again, he'd be taking a plunge on a bike that he doesn't know, that he might get on with and he might not. I just don't see it, and he'd be going back to being a satellite rider. Yeah, it's a factory spec bike, but as you guys have said,
it's not the shiny factory thing, is it?
Was to be a factory rider and lead the development. So I don't see, at his age, he's 27, why he would, want to go back after doing one sprint race, as Lewis has said, as a factory rider, to suddenly decide that you'd rather be a satellite rider again. I don't know. It doesn't. None of the options really make sense to me. There's 4 teams, isn't there, officially, that have seats for next year. If we're just looking at next year, Honda is the only factory one. Then there's LCR, Pramac, and VR46. Maybe there could be other movements, who knows, but that's on paper all that's available for next year. Whereas the year after, a lot of the contracts are up for renewal because like Martin, they're at the moment, they're on a 2-year contract cycle, aren't they? So again, breaking that 2-year contract cycle as well, it just puts you in a situation where you're limited on your options as to what you can do. I really don't see anything that's overwhelmingly better than the situation that he's in. I just... Again, there's obviously much more to this that we don't know, because I don't see why you would go to all this, go through all this to end up where, to come back to your question, what is this end result that could be so overwhelmingly better than where he is now, given that also, as we know, the whole 850cc rules are on the horizon and nobody knows quite what's going to happen in those. So it just seems like everything is just up in the air at the moment.
The Yamaha thing at going back to Pramac, he's going to be expected to develop a bike. Look at we got the French Grand Prix. The Pramac Yamaha riders got the same engine upgrade and chassis upgrade that the factory riders have. They've been an intrinsic part of that. That was the whole point of bringing that project together. So, yeah, if that was ending, that would be what would happen. He would be going back into a situation where he's expected to develop a bike, but also you would then have to learn the bike to then develop it, to then leave again when a factory contract comes up. So,
and also have to deal with Fabio Quartararo too, which I wouldn't want to be doing as well. So that's a thing too, isn't it?
You look at Le Mans just as an isolated example. He was 8/10 faster than the next best Yamaha in qualifying. So,
Yeah.
and to be fair, it was a special lap, so that's not a weekly occurrence. But still, you look at the kind of the overall performance, and you look at the difference maker there, and from Pramac's point of view and Yamaha's point of view as well, if they're looking to just see out until they get to the kind of contract cycle for 27, sorry, Jack Miller's done a really good job on that bike. Like, he's done a really, really good job. He comes at probably a very cut rate price there for the kind of job that he's doing right now, and he deserves another year. Frankly, he took the ride. It was kind of it was a last option. Let's be real about it. It was kind of a last sort of throw of the dice, really, from where he was at the middle of last year. And he's made it work, and he's committed to it. He's really put everything into it, and he deserves another shot. Going back to Martin, I'm going to make the spicy take that I promised Jordan, even though you didn't give yours, but that's fine.
Oh no, mine would be too much. It would be, I would be on this podcast next week if I gave mine.
There is an angle to all of this that we, do have to come to terms with, and everyone has to reckon with, is that Aprilia wins its legal battle. It can hold Jorge Martin to its contract. Assume that Honda's the only destination he wants to go to. Aprilia locks him into his contract. Honda, as is tradition, as we know, Honda will then not try and sign him. They know if he's not on the market, then they're not going to try and weasel him out of a contract. So they sign someone else, whether it's Zarco, whether they get Marini back on a contract, whether it's Acosta, they go in another direction. Aprilia goes, we cannot trust you anymore. The team has fallen to bits around you. We're terminating your contract for next year, which would be well within its rights to terminate the contract, pay him the next year of his contract, and he doesn't race. There is a situation here where Jorge Martin isn't on the grid next year. Because of the actions that he's doing now, that is a legitimate possibility. Yep. Just because he's a world champion doesn't protect you from having a seat next year, because we are in such a closed market at this point, with options that he will not want to go to, and that other teams won't want to accept a rider who, even if he is a world champion, who is kind of frozen himself off the grid. Someone like Pramac, despite the connections, VR46 for example, aren't going to kind of take a rider who's just there because that's his only option.
Yeah.
And I know I just said about Jack Miller that it was kind of last resort. Pramac wanted him. They and Yamaha wanted him. They offered him the deal. They didn't go to him because there was a couple other ways they could have went with that. So that is a real possibility. And there has been some suggestion from Spanish media that the championship is not very happy with Jorge Martin right now, and there is a suggestion that they are, if he goes ahead with this and he does get out of the contract, that they're not really going to accept that. And so that's then the next problem, is that because this is reputationally quite bad for MotoGP, this is the point where it's trying to grow its championship. It has on its intro graphics that Jorge Martin's the number one.
Yeah, and the whole every team has a world champion sort of thing, the factory push, yeah.
But also because moves like this are damaging to a manufacturer's status and to a team. Because if you're a sponsor, for example, and you look at that, you're going to go, oh, we're not going to put money into that next year. If you're a prospective sponsor, you're only going to look at the very sort of baseline, what's going on here. Oh, this rider didn't want to be here. The world champion didn't want to be here because he said the bike wasn't very good, without interrogating further into it. And that's bad for other teams as well, because Martin becomes a bit of a poison chalice. He becomes a bit too radioactive. If you're a sponsor, if you're a big company, for example, wants to put a lot, millions of euros into a MotoGP team, and you've seen this rider here that's already done this to one team, you're going to be like, I'm not sure about that. Don't want him on my promotion material in case he leaves after 5 minutes. So you can understand from the championship's perspective why that's not a great kind of look. And also, okay, it's great for us. It's great for the fans. They like all this juicy stuff. As of midday on Monday, well, it wasn't even, that was 10 o'clock Monday morning, we've stopped talking about the French Grand Prix and Johann Zarco.
That's really annoying me.
And that historic victory and the championship and all the rest of it, and we're only talking about this one very, very negative thing. And before anyone says, oh, well, you don't have to, this is what we get paid for, we do have to, shut up. We have to talk about this, and everyone will talk about this and continue to talk about this. And when we get to Silverstone next Thursday, it's not, oh, look at this great British Grand Prix we got. It's, what's your opinion on Jorge Martin? What's your opinion on Aprilia? Marco Bezzecchi? Why are you said you want your teammate back. He doesn't want to be here. That must be a bit shit for you. That's all that's going to be talked about, and that will rumble on and on and on and on until Martin comes back, at which point it's like, everyone will be fully on, what the hell are you doing? And it's very much like, remember, was it 2 years ago we had all the race direction, the stewarding problems with Marquez, cancel penalty,
and the penalty,
and we spent weeks talking about that instead of the racing. Well, this is going to go on for months, and you can understand why the championship's not happy about that, because that's, it keeps it in the headlines, but it's not positive. It's a negative thing, and it makes the championship look quite bad as well, that something like this could happen. So, yeah, I think that is an important thing to remember, is that this could all end up with Jorge Martin not on the grid next year. And if you're not on the grid next year, why the hell should a team sign you for 2027?
Shelf life, isn't it? It's all about your current shelf life. And I think
doesn't matter if
doesn't matter.
Look at Marc Marquez. He was an 8-time world champion at the point he left Honda. When he went to Gresini, it was very much a last kind of, if this doesn't work out, you are kind of done. And there was a lot of people already wrote him off.
Yeah.
Same with Rossi when he came back from Ducati, written him off, and then he went and fought for a championship. You're only, it's a very short memory thing, and people can go, oh, well, you can't forget world champion. Of course you can. As far as mainstream appeal goes, and we've said this before in the podcast, that Jorge Martin isn't the most popular world champion, and he's not going to be very popular after this. And we haven't really kind of seen what Jorge Martin can do in a situation like this year against Marc on the top bike. Looking at the results of Pecco, a guy that won 11 Grand Prix last year and almost beat Martin, you kind of have to look at that as being, well, he's probably not winning the champion. He wouldn't be winning the championship if he stayed at Pramac on a Ducati anyway. So it's like Joan Mir. It's very much like he's a world champion. You can respect that, but like the overall stock that's brought him, and it's the same with Martin, is very, very small. And this incident, this whole situation, really further reduces that for Martin. So reputationally, he's not doing himself any favors to kind of secure his future long term.
Yeah, and suppose on that, Pete, where do you think he'll end up after all this? Do you think he'll? Do you think? Where out of your predictions, where do you think he'll go? That's what I really want to ask.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing for me is it's sad that we're not potentially going to see, as Lewis has said, the chance for Martin to show what he can do leading a factory. This is what we were looking forward to. He'd been on the best bike in a satellite team and everything else, and here was his chance to really, take his riding to the next step in his career and turn a factory around. And we were all excited to see, another factory up there fighting for the front. So that's another element of this that we won't get if this all goes wrong. But I mean, where would it? As I say, for next year, there's only one factory seat free that we know of. That we've just spoken about at Honda, but it's far from guaranteed, isn't it? For various reasons, that would actually happen. And then who replaces him then if he doesn't ride at Aprilia? They're going to have to bring somebody in, or they're going to have to promote someone. Do they do it just for the rest of this season and then someone else for next year? I mean, I have no idea what Jorge Martin is planning for next year or the rest of this season, to be honest. I think that's what we're all waiting on. John, did you want my who would you put at Aprilia if he moves? Or
go for that. Yeah, because we can answer that as well. Yeah, give me your answer for that one.
Yeah, I mean, short term, I think as in for the rest of this season. I mean, Ayagura has got the best results for Aprilia this year, hasn't he? At the same time, it's hard for a satellite team to lose their star rider. And let's remember
that takes away from them completely.
Exactly, especially when, let's be honest, Davide Brivio took quite a lot of stick for signing Agura, didn't he? And not some other riders for that place. And he's taken that decision.
Yeah,
he's sort of put everything on the line to get Agura there. It's paid off, and then off he might go. But I mean, there's nobody ready to step into the role, is there? That's the other thing to point out. We've seen in the past, you've had, I suppose, in the Dovizioso case, somebody who stepped back, as Lewis said, he found himself without any options, but that also put him in a prime position to step in if a ride suddenly became available. There's nobody really in that situation. Augusto Fernandez is the nearest at Yamaha, but we know that he's sort of seeing his future very much with Yamaha. He hopes as a race rider, but if not, I think he said, I'm happy leading this project at a time when it's there's so much going on with different bikes and everything else. So I think for this year, well, I suppose if we look back, let's kind of had a similar situation when Ian Oney was pulled out of the Aprilia team by the drugs ban, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And what did they do then? Then they looked to their test riders and filled the gap with that. They tried to sign some Moto2 guys. That would be potentially an option because Moto2 riders, usually there's a clause that if they get a MotoGP option, they can leave. So but to take a big gamble on that at a factory team, I don't know. I think probably they stick with Savadori, to be honest, for the short term while things settle down. I mean, who knows what twists and turns are ahead in all this? Are they all going to, magically kiss and make up and Marty comes back? We don't know. But I think, if they don't, then they're going to have to find somebody else, another big name, ideally, to lead the project next year. We know they like Italian riders. They made a big deal of signing Marco Bezzecchi for this year. You've got Luca Marini, who's got experience and is free, potentially, at least out of contract at the end of this year. Also Franco Morbidelli.
Didn't think about that. Actually, that's a good point, Pete. I haven't thought about that.
Those guys, it depends what angle they want on this, isn't it? They were looking for, let's face it, they're not going to find another, a reigning world champion to come in.
An A-lister, essentially. They're not going to get the top 3-4 riders. So, yeah, do you know what? I'm kind of in the same boat there in terms of where I think Martin will end up. Just going by reports, I'm going to take the safe option. Probably Honda, but then again, it's like the points we've brought up. It's like you've got Costa, Zarco. It's like
the legal battle,
the
as
legal
well.
side,
exactly, legal side of it. Honda aren't going to want to get involved in that, and it's like, well, how long do Honda wait if they really, really want Martin? And say this legal case goes on for, I don't know how many months. You can't put a stamp on it, really, and then Honda might lose out on something. So yeah, ideally, if he really wants Honda, and it all plays out nicely for Martin in terms of the legal side, and he gets it, I could see it there. But I kind of agree with you, Lewis. He could end up on the sidelines, to be honest, for a year, and then it's really what happens after that. And then in terms of who replaces him at Aprilia, because I do think no matter what comes out of this, he will not be on Aprilia eventually. Obviously, I think that's pretty clear here. He's not going to be on Aprilia for, I don't know, a year or whatever after. If it's this year, well, Savadori probably stands in and takes the remainder of the season, and they treat it as a test for the year for the bike development. And in terms of next year, Ayagura potentially for 1 year, you could look at that and be like, okay, let's see what you can do. If you're in a factory sort of environment, let's see if it brings the best out of him, because I think he's shown that he's been the best Aprilia rider this year, and that's probably the safe option. Moto2, do you look at someone like Manu Gonzalez, for example, where he's got close ties with Yamaha in the past, and potentially there's a Pramac side angle into that if he wins the title really convincingly. To look at him on a cheap option, then you're looking at someone who's got no MotoGP experience for 1 year on a bike that's going to change, that sort of thing. Luca Marini, I suppose, is a really good option, and I think about that. He's a good rider in terms of bike development. We've seen it at Honda, and I suppose the Ducati days as well. He's kind of been in big factories, understands that sort of pressure that comes with it. Yeah, it's hard for me to say where someone for Aprilia. I mean, I'm going to throw it out there. I don't want to start something. I mean, the top rack rumour has been pretty quiet this week, and we kind of said beforehand, Lewis, but haven't seen that mentioned. There's surely no world in which top rack ends up at Aprilia for 26 if he's really that desperate to go to MotoGP. That would be a real surprise, wouldn't it?
I mean, I guess if you're Aprilia, a good way to kind of rebuild sort of positive image is to make a big shock signing like that. But yeah, I mean, I think if you kind of look at it from next year, I assume Marty's not on the bike, and yeah, I mean, if he does end up at Honda, and you kind of think Luca Marini is a fair trade there, because Honda really likes his analytical approach to bike development. Excuse me, his analytical approach to bike development, and that's something Aprilia could really benefit from. But say that nothing changes at Honda, or just looking at maybe somewhere else on the grid, there are KTM riders that are, not happy with the situation right now. The future still remains really uncertain for KTM. As far as we're aware at this point, they haven't still secured the funding they need to pay off their debts by the 23rd of May. So, there is a possible kind of collapse still on the horizon there for them. Does that pave the way for, as a short term, we need a quick, cheap replacement in Bastianini? That was their kind of preferred option last year before he went the KTM direction. It hasn't worked out at KTM. Could it work out better at Aprilia? An all-Italian lineup would probably be something that would suit them. So, yeah, maybe he's your kind of... I don't think Tech 3 or KTM would really to put up much of a fight to hold on to Bastianini, given his results so far. So, yeah, maybe that's the route they go down.
Yeah, that's a good one. So I think Avagura would be my option. Pete, who was your option if we're going to replace Martin?
For next year.
Yeah, or whenever it's going to be.
Assume next year.
Yeah,
assume next year. Yeah.
I'll go with an Italian. So yeah, Marini.
Okay.
Marini, Morbidelli, Bastianini, any of those guys. Of course, if you're looking at a rider in a satellite team who sort of deserves to potentially move up, Maverick, but of course he's just left Aprilia, hasn't he? So, I mean, otherwise he would be a prime target, wouldn't he? If you were looking at a factory team that potentially was looking for a satellite star. But yeah, I go with the Italian option, I would say. But
and Lewis, you've gone for the similar, like sort of Bastianini sort of stopgap. Yeah, that's fair. And to be honest, the more I think about the Bastianini one now, I'm like, actually, you know what? Maybe that would be half a year too late for Bastianini, because he obviously wanted that seat, I think, obviously before the KTM deal.
Let me throw a curveball out there. We're about to head to the British Grand Prix, where we're not expecting a very big crowd. We know MotoGP is not super popular in Britain right now. Maybe Dorna looks at potentially, say Ogura comes up to the factory team. Maybe Dorna looks at trying to put Jake Dixon at Trackhouse, try and get things a bit more, bit interest there. That's a big possibility. And there's one rider out of contract for next year that we haven't spoken about in that role, who, has proven that he's a good factory rider and good development rider. Jack Miller.
Yeah, true.
Why would you not want a guy that's ridden Hondas, ridden Ducatis, ridden Yamahas to help? That's.
Complete the set and get on everything.
Miller's not too old either. He's 29, so I think so.
Yeah,
something like that. So he's maybe Jack Miller's the maybe he's the curveball option in this whole thing.
Yeah, maybe he could be. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting to talk about silly season this early, in terms of for next year. But it'll be a very interesting summer to see how everything plays out. And I do think that whatever comes from this, a lot of teams will be making sure their contracts and everything are, how can I say, better worded. Because I want to say, Pete, the last thing, this isn't the first time that Jorge Martin's got out of a contract through a clause that people might not know about his Moto 2 contract with KTM. It was, I believe I'm right in saying, was it worded due to the season from a date, wasn't it? That he had to be inside the top 3 in the championship or something like that. And obviously, if you're new around here in 2020, there was a thing called the pandemic, and there was there was no racing, and he got out of that contract purely because I think it came on the 1st of July or something, wasn't it, by the summer break, and he then got out of his KTM contract to then go to Pramac. So this is something, isn't it, for teams to kind of look at in terms of future dealings with any rider. Wording's key here, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It is interesting that this sort of as echoes this situation now, with a similar situation with a clause that wasn't expected to be used in that way. But as we know, with legal things, it's what's in black and white. It's what exactly is written down. And as you say, I think since then, they've swapped, instead of having a date in a contract for a performance clause, it's now a round or a race number to take into account. Of course, nobody imagined the season, a pandemic and the season not starting until whatever it was, mid-July. as it did in 2020. So it was put in as a date in the contract, and of course there'd be no racing, so it was impossible to be in the top places in the championship. So now it's done by round, and as you say, I think let's see what comes out of this, but there'll be more lessons learned about exactly how you word these sort of clauses, because it's a tricky one, isn't it? But the bottom line is, regardless of the legalities, it comes back to, as I think we've all said here, if a rider doesn't want to race for a team, you can't force them. And that's the problem, isn't it, here? If you don't want to be together, if riders and teams don't want to be together, whatever the trigger is for a disagreement, you can't, there's no point trying to, as we've seen in the past with Zarco, with Vinales, there's no point trying to force the relationship, force people to stay together. It's almost a marriage, isn't it? A team,
yeah.
A team rider situation. And if it's just not working, or if one party is just not fully committed to it, it's just not better. You can't force people to give their, put their lives on the line, basically, and for a team to expect that everything is going to be 100% effort wise. So regardless of the reason, if it's come to sort of a head as it appears, then it's hard to see a way out of this, as I think we've said here this morning.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've covered it very well, gents. Hope we're here next week to discuss, unless the sort of legal teams are knocking on our doors here. But I think we'll be around, so we will. And Lewis actually said something about KTM on the 23rd of May. I mean, Silverstone's going to be a fun place to be if there's KTM and Aprilia stuff floating around. And yeah, we'll try and find stuff out for you if you're listening. We'll all be there. And I hope you're going to be there too if you're planning on going to Silverstone. I hope the weather's nice. And yeah, let's hope we get some... Most importantly, get some good racing on track, because that's what MotoGP is all about, and we want to see the track action be the main talking point instead of all this contract stuff with riders. I think you only talk about it so much before you start getting annoyed by it yourself. So, and we'll see you again next week. Take care.